Today we're going to continue our discussion of the American Revolution. Specifically, we'll talk about some of the key battles that take place during the war, and we'll end up with a discussion of the aftermath and some of the long-term impact of the war. This is where we left off on the previous session. The war itself can be broken down into three phases. The first few years of the war, most of the fighting is going to take place in the northern colonies. Between 75 and 78, of course, we already talked about a couple of those first battles, Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. But once the war begins in earnest, most of the main battles will take place in those northern colonies, primarily New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and the New England area. After 1778, the fighting is going to shift into the southern colonies, and there'll still be some fighting that takes place in the north, but most of the major battles during the second phase take place in the southern colonies and in the frontier areas. The third phase of the war, there's not really any fighting going on. It's mainly just negotiations between the U.S. delegates and British government trying to outline a peace agreement. Not really much fighting taking place during that last phase of the war. Taking a look at our map here, we can see 76 and 77, most of the fighting is taking place in these New England areas. And if you look at the map here, you can see that most of these battles that are occurring are taking place in the same areas where most of the fighting took place during those colonial wars for empire. In fact, in the early couple of years of the American Revolution, it looks just like all those previous wars for empire, including the French and Indian War. So very similar strategies and tactics are going to be used here in this American Revolution. You can see here from the red arrows representing the British forces, their main strategy, they're using these strategic waterways, lakes and rivers, in an attempt to try and cut off the New England area from the rest of the colonies. And it's, of course, keep in mind from the British perspective, this is where most of the trouble was here in the New England area. They assume that if they can cut this area off and control it, then the revolution will come to a swift end. We see very few victories on the side of the Americans during this time phase. A few minor victories, but most of this first phase of the war is going to be characterized by British victories and American losses. After 78, of course, the French will join the war. We'll talk more about that here in a few minutes. But the fighting shifts into the south. The British believe that they have a strong loyalist support in the South, and they feel that they have better chances of success winning victories in the South, and then they will refocus their efforts later on again in the North. But this is where the last battles will take place. The Battle of Yorktown in 81. We'll talk more about that here in a minute as well. And remind, of course, just once again, the third phase of the war is characterized mainly by negotiations for the peace. Taking a look at some key battles here, it's important to note that there are numerous battles that take place during the American Revolution. This war lasts, the fighting part of this war covers about 6 years. There's dozens and dozens of important battles that take place during that time. There's no way we can discuss them all. An in-depth discussion of all these battles is kind of outside the scope of our course. But there are a few that are important enough to shape this story, and we should take a look at some of those. First up is the Battle of Trenton. This is in the winter of 1776, during the first few months of the war. It's going to be one of the first important victories for the Americans. Up till December of 76, the Americans, Continental Army had suffered numerous setbacks, British victories in several different places, particularly in New York area and other places in that surrounding area, the Continental Army had not done well. So morale is kind of low at this point. A lot of people are questioning whether or not we should have gotten into a war with England. We've lost several after Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. Things kind of turned against us in terms of what's happening on the battlefield. So a lot of people are starting to have doubts as to whether or not we can actually win this war against England. So in December of 1776, George Washington gets the idea to he finds an opportunity to turn things around for America in terms of especially in terms of morale. Place called Trenton, New Jersey. What happens is that this battle will be unorthodox in pretty much every way imaginable. Washington will. This Battle of Trenton is also a good demonstration of, or a good example of Washington's skill as a leader and his creative thinking in terms of how he continually turned disadvantages into advantages throughout the war. Keep in mind, Washington is very aware of all those disadvantages that we discussed in our last session. He knows that the British have superior numbers and superior supplies and training and so forth, and he's going to use his disadvantages to an advantage in this case of the Battle of Trenton. So what happens is that we'll go ahead and take a look at this picture as we're discussing the events of the battle. What Washington's going to do here is he's thinking outside the box. He knows how European armies fight. He's studied this, for many years. He's very familiar with what they do and what they expect and how their type of fighting and strategy takes place. And he's going to use that against them. Typically, during this part of history, armies don't fight during the winter months. Most armies, if there's a war going on, the armies will move into winter quarters or winter camps, and they'll just wait out the foul weather. And once the weather turns good again in the spring, then they will resume fighting. They'll use their months spent in winter quarters to resupply themselves and treat wounded and do some training and just kind of regroup. So that's what's taken place during this December of 1776. The British troops are rallying and regrouping, and most of the Continental Army, of course, is doing this as well. But Washington decides to use this as an opportunity to strike a blow against one of England's allies, the Hessian mercenaries. Hessians are one of the many German ethnic groups that are basically fighting on the side of England here. So England is using these mercenaries to augment their troops in America, and a group of these Hessian mercenaries are camped in Trenton, New Jersey. So Washington decides to attack them during the middle of the winter. They won't be expecting it. He further colors outside the lines here by planning his attack to take place at night, and this is another thing that just didn't happen very often in warfare during this time period. Most battles took place out in the open, in daylight, where the armies could see and maneuver more easily. Nighttime fighting was just not something that really took place. So Washington is attacking in the middle of winter. It's in the middle of the night, and of course the night he chose very specifically was Christmas Eve, in December of 76. So the Hessian mercenaries camped in Trenton will be completely caught off guard by this. And this painting we're looking at here is probably one of the most famous paintings from this era. The painting, of course, was done many years after the war, but it's one of the more famous depictions of the American Revolution. Washington here is seen standing up in this boat as the boat crosses he's leading his Continental Army across the Delaware River between Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Now if we can talk about this painting just for a minute, this is kind of interesting. This is a part of our perception of the Revolution is derived from the art that was done in years later depicting these events. This event in particular portrays Washington as in a very heroic pose here, standing up in this boat. Of course, his color bearer standing behind him with the flag open up here. Now, this type of thing probably would not happen in real life. You're in a small rowboat. It's overloaded with people crossing an icy river in the middle of the night. It's probably not a good idea to be standing up in a boat like this, especially not holding a big flag that could easily catch the wind and tip this boat over and put all these men in the frozen water, which would almost certainly be a death sentence for most of them. So this is kind of an unrealistic portrayal of what's taken place here. But it is very heroic. And Washington is essentially the hero of this story. This plan was designed by him and led by him, and it's a very important moment in our story. And the artist felt it important to portray the hero of that event in a very heroic pose. More than likely, Washington and his color bearer were both seated in the bottom of the boat, just trying to stay warm as they paddled across the river here. But that wouldn't look very heroic. And again, the purpose of art sometimes is to tell a story. And the story we're telling here is the story of this heroic battle of Trenton. So anyway, the Washington and his Continental Army will invade the city of Trenton and take the Hessian mercenaries by surprise completely. This is going to be a very one-sided battle in favor of the Continental Army. Washington will lose very few men as casualties, and they will end up capturing almost 1,000 of these Hessian mercenaries. Again, caught completely by surprise. This is going to be a big victory for our Continental Army. And what's so important about this is that while Trenton was not that important in terms of its strategic value, and the Hessians were basically just playing a small part in this. This is not going to be a devastating defeat for England, but it is a big boost for American morale. Word of this spreads around through the colonies, and people will begin to renew their faith in the cause. They see this victory as, okay, we pulled off a victory. Our leader, George Washington, is very crafty, a military genius, and he's got us back in the game. It's not over for us yet. We're still in the game. We still have a chance of winning, as demonstrated by our hero, George Washington. So the Battle of Trenton is an important battle because it turns the attitude of the war in a more positive light. In the interim, of course, after Trenton, there'll be a couple more minor victories for the Americans. Some harsh setbacks early in the fall of '77. The British will take Philadelphia, so our Continental Congress will have to relocate and reconvene in another city. So Philadelphia is kind of a symbolic loss there. But so we have some more setbacks. Things are going to turn around for us again in October of '77, the Battle of Saratoga. And this battle is probably one of the most important battles of the war, because not just because it's a victory for the Americans, but this is a major turning point, because it's after this battle that France finally agrees to join the war on our side. What's happening is that, well, first of all, let's just talk about the battle itself. Kind of zoom in here on upstate New York. We see Saratoga here along the Hudson River, just north of Albany. Now we can see here the British strategy, just like we talked about in all those previous wars for empire. They are using these strategic waterways, rivers and lakes, in an attempt to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. So this is part of their strategy. George Washington and his generals, Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, they are familiar with this strategy as well. They were all part of the French and Indian War. They remember these types of strategies, so this is no big surprise. They're anticipating this move on the part of the British. So they're ready for them, and they were able to stop them at Saratoga. This is where the main battle takes place. There's several smaller battles that take place in the days and weeks right before this. Saratoga is kind of the climax of this New York campaign. So this is going to be a major victory in and of itself. We're going to see as a result of this, England is going to have, or excuse me, the Americans will capture about 5,700 British soldiers here. Now this is a big deal. This 5,700 British prisoners ends up being about a fifth of the total number of British troops that are in the colonies at this point. So this is a major defeat for the British Army in and of itself. So if we just look at this battle by itself, out of context, it is a significant victory for the Continental Army. But when we look at it in the context of the overall picture, it's even more significant, because up to this point, France had been unwilling to consider an alliance with us because they didn't feel we had a chance of winning this war. From the moment war was declared, Benjamin Franklin was in Paris continually trying to negotiate with French leaders for support. France refused to support us because they didn't really believe that we had a chance of winning. And the last thing France wanted was to end up on the losing side of another war with England. So they pretty much flat out refused to help us until the Battle of Saratoga. Our American victory at this battle convinces France that we actually have a chance of winning this war, and so they see now the probability of American victory is a little bit more a little bit higher at this point. They feel it's a little bit more worth their risk. So here is, of course, our British General Burgoyne surrendering to the American General Horatio Gates at the Battle of Saratoga. But again, what's so important about Saratoga is that this is a major turning point. Up to this point, the war had not been going well for us. We had, but despite a few minor victories, the British had pretty much been controlling the way the war unfolded. After Saratoga, things will turn in our favor because France now will join the fight. They won't actually sign a treaty until February of the following year, but it's because of this battle that they are willing to make that agreement with us. Now, just in terms of logistics, it's going to take France quite a few months to actually mobilize their forces and get them here to America. So it's not like things are going to turn around immediately. It'll be well into the next year before things really start to turn our way. But that process begins here with our victory at Saratoga. Following Saratoga, Washington's army will attempt to retake Philadelphia, and that will be unsuccessful. The British have too strong of a hold on Philadelphia, and that'll be another defeat, another setback for us. And it's at that point Washington decides to set up a winter camp in a place called Valley Forge. It's in Pennsylvania, and it's about 15-20 miles outside of Philadelphia. So during this winter camp, where the Continental Army is here for about 6 months total. This is not the entire army. This is just the main body of the Continental Army under the direct command of George Washington. There are other elements of the Continental Army in other places, but this is kind of the main body. About 12,000 men will be camped here at Valley Forge. There's not a whole lot going on here. Like I say, this is just a winter quarters, a winter camp. The army is regrouping, re-equipping, and just kind of tending their wounds, so to speak, while they're waiting for spring thaw. But what's important about Valley Forge is how it becomes a symbol for American determination during the Revolution. We see this is kind of a low point, another low point for morale at this winter camp. It's in the middle of winter. Living conditions are very sparse and very rough. It's in the middle of winter, obviously, so it's cold outside. Food and other supplies are in short supply. A lot of the men who are, of course, using their own equipment, their own clothing. They've been fighting for a couple of years at this point. Their uniforms and shoes are worn out, and so there's a struggle here. One of the big struggles at Valley Forge is to try and re-equip this Continental Army with the supplies that they need to continue fighting in the spring. You take a look at a image of Valley Forge while we're continuing the discussion. We look at you could Google up Valley Forge and look at images, and you'll see 1,000 different images done by 1,000 different artists. This has become one of the more popular themes in American revolutionary history in terms of telling the story of the Revolution. The experience of Valley Forge has become it's another one of those touchstone moments like the Boston Massacre or the Boston Tea Party. This is the stuff of legend. A lot of the legendary aspects of the Revolution are tied very closely to the experience here at Valley Forge. Now, while there was suffering, there was hardship here. There were shortages of food, shortages of clothing, fuel for firewood was in short supply. They cut down most of the trees in the area. The conditions were very harsh. But the stories that came out of this experience, you kind of tended to exaggerate some of the conditions. And of course, the more the stories were told throughout the generations, the more dramatic the suffering became. There's legends of people, large numbers of troops freezing to death, and even larger numbers of troops deserting because of the hardships. At the historical records, the journals and letters written by the men who were at Valley Forge are our best source of information in terms of what actually happened there. And while there is mention of desertions, the primary source information isn't real specific in terms of numbers. So you read 10 different sources of Valley Forge, you'll find 10 different numbers of desertions. Most are just vague. They'll say numerous desertions or many desertions. But in truth, there was only about 42 men that were tried in the military court for deserting at Valley Forge. So desertion is a common problem that armies at this time deal with. Life in the field is hard, and a lot of men who are undisciplined or untrained will desert. But again, as far as specific numbers, the only specific evidence we have points to a relatively small number of men actually deserting at Valley Forge. But the legend becomes the focus of our story. Our perceptions, our perceptions of this event are formed largely due to the legends. The same is true with people freezing to death. There were numerous casualties at Valley Forge. In between about 1,700 to 2,000 men will die at Valley Forge, but almost all of those are going to be from sickness. Cholera, typhoid, the influenza were the big killers of men at Valley Forge. And while numerous men were treated for exposure to the cold, frostbite, and so forth, there's no specific mention of anyone dying from freezing to death. So again, we can't say for sure. There's no specific mention of anyone freezing to death, but given the conditions, it is possible. But the many images that we have to choose from to depict life at Valley Forge, I chose this one specifically because it's kind of a composite. It represents all the classic elements of the legend of Valley Forge. the austere living conditions, these provisional huts built by the men themselves, were drafty and cold and damp. Conditions were harsh. The foreground here, we've got several Continental Army soldiers huddled around a very small fire. Their clothes are very tattered. You can see this soldier here, his shoes are pretty much gone. He's got his feet wrapped up in cloth. And this is again, there were shortages of clothing, but there was a Herculean attempt to resupply men with clothing and shoes made and gathered and donated from local towns. So conditions were harsh. The condition of the men was ragged and worn out, but they survived. So here we're looking at composite images here of the types of things that were present at Valley Forge. Most noteworthy in this particular image is the snow on the ground, and pretty much every image you find of Valley Forge, you're going to see everything covered with snow. It is the middle of winter, so it did snow, but this was not the harshest winter in Pennsylvania history. Most of the legends we can tie to a harsher winter that took place the following year, winter of 78, 79. That winter was unusually harsh, but the winter at Valley Forge was not anything untypical for Pennsylvania winters. It did snow, but there wasn't snow on the ground the whole time. Again, we see depictions of this in the harshest possible way, because those are the stories that are told, and this is how we remember it. Another important thing that's happening at Valley Forge, you can see depicted in the background here. You see formations of troops conducting close order drill. And this was probably one of the most important things that happened at Valley Forge, was the training of Continental Army troops. We're still early in the war, and our Continental Army, of course, originally made up of men from local militias. It takes a while to get these men trained. This is part of the reason the Continental Army is not doing so well during those first couple of years, is they are still trying to put this army together. They're still trying to train these men in professional military tactics. And that process is ongoing here at Valley Forge. As luck would have it for these men, a Prussian officer, Baron Friedrich von Steuben, he's here as an observer. There were several European officers embedded in the Continental Army. They were here as observers. There were French officers here observing. Again, they wanted to get a feel for what's going on with this revolution. This is kind of a big deal. There's no real precedent for this. Colonies rising up against a parent nation. It's not something that happens all the time, so there was a lot of interest in this from other countries. So one of these foreign officers, this Baron von Steuben, Prussian officer, he's here, and he volunteers to help train these Continental Army soldiers in close order drill. Basically, you marching in formation, various manual of arms, and so forth. While these things seem kind of trivial on the surface, they're important in building unit cohesion and discipline and uniformity of action. And this is an essential element in warfare during this time period. Weapons in this period of history are notoriously inaccurate. The only way you can be effective on the battlefield is for all the soldiers in the formation to be doing the same thing at the same moment. So every soldier needs to fire his weapon at the same time in order to ensure maximum damage on the enemy. This is just the way wars are fought, as kind of the limitations of the technology. In order for that to happen, then the men need to be well rehearsed and well drilled on their manual of arms in terms of how they're loading and reloading and aiming and firing and so forth. And this takes practice. And von Steuben is working with the Continental Army here at Valley Forge, continuing their training in this close order drill, which will help develop the discipline that they need to fight, and of course the skill they need to operate as a single unit and not just a mob of individuals. And if you remember the illustration we saw of the militia on Bunker Hill, they appeared to be a little bit disorganized, and everybody's kind of doing their own thing. So drill and training here at Valley Forge is helping to improve that coordination and discipline. So a lot of things going on at Valley Forge, important things, but what's important to know is that we realize that stories from Valley Forge are going to become part of the legend of the Revolution, specifically America's determination to endure great hardship in order to achieve this goal of independence. Valley Forge becomes a symbol of that struggle. Even though this was pretty much a standard winter camp in most respects, it becomes a symbol of our struggle. All right. Of course, we know that in '78 France will join the war, and that'll take time to get that support rolling there. Eventually, things will turn around. At this point, too, in '78, fighting now has shifted into the south. There's still some small-scale battles taking place in the north, but the main battles, the most significant battles, are taking place in the south after '78. Another interesting piece here is that in the summer of '79, Spain will join the war on the side of America and France. Now, of course, this was largely due to France had convinced Spain to join the war. It's just kind of added assurance. Now, Spain was not really that interested in our cause. American independence was not something that Spain was really concerned about. They didn't really care one way or the other whether we were independent or not. But Spain has their own agenda here. Spain sees this as an opportunity to settle some old grievances with England, and also to get back a little bit of their own territory. In fact, earlier in 1781, Spain will seize or attack and seize Florida from the British. Again, remember earlier on in the story, Spain controlled Florida originally, so they gave it up to England during at the end of the French and Indian War. Spain sees this alliance with America here as an opportunity to regain some of their old territory. They will make an important contribution, though. They will provide American or the Continental Army with supplies and weapons, which are, of course, very much needed at this point. Our ability to supply ourselves is very limited. France has provided a lot of support at this point, and Spain will participate in that manner as well. The last important battle of the Revolution takes place in Virginia, a place called Yorktown, in October of '81. Now, while peace treaty won't be signed until 2 years later, the Battle of Yorktown is the last significant battle to take place during the war. Remember, the third phase, those last 2 years of the war, is going to be spent primarily negotiating between British and American delegates, negotiating for peace in Paris. Taking a look at our map here, the Battle of Yorktown. This is in Virginia, of course, right on the Chesapeake Bay here. A trivial footnote for you: this final battle of the Revolution, which basically brings to an end British dominance of North America, takes place just a few miles away from the first British settlement in North America. Jamestown is just across this Hampton Peninsula, about 10 miles away, 10 or 15 miles away. So it's kind of the stories come full circle here, where Jamestown marked the beginning of British settlement in North America, and of course the Battle of Yorktown marks the end of British dominance in North America. Of course, Canada will remain in British control after the American Revolution, but so they won't be totally out of the picture. But this just marks the end of their dominance in North America. So, Battle of Yorktown. The French are here in full force. By this point, they've arrived in significant numbers. They've fought in several major battles, and we and the French have surrounded the British Army under command of Lord Cornwallis in a place called Yorktown. Basically, after several different defeats in further south in the Carolinas, Cornwallis and the British Army repositioned themselves in Yorktown in order to be resupplied and receive reinforcements. That proved to be a mistake, because by the time Cornwallis rallies at Yorktown, the French Navy has already blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, basically preventing Cornwallis from receiving any kind of reinforcements, and also preventing him from escaping. So he has no choice but to surrender at Yorktown, and this will be basically the final, once the British Army, this is the bulk of the British Army in the colonies, once they surrender here at Yorktown, this will kind of send a signal to England. Once they hear about this, they'll realize, the British government realizes that there's no way they can win this war, at least not quickly, and certainly not cheaply. So they realize at this point it's pretty much over. So now is when they begin the process of negotiating with us for peace, and that process will take the next couple of years. What's interesting too here, take a look at this painting. This is the British surrender at Yorktown. Traditionally, the British commander, or the commander of the losing army, will present his saber to the commander of the victorious army, just as a symbol of surrender. Okay, you beat us. Congratulations. Here's my saber. I officially surrender to you, and so on. It's just part of it's just how battles were fought in this colonial era. What's interesting about the Battle of Yorktown is that Cornwallis was a British aristocrat, and he felt that just having to come here and fight these colonial armies, what he referred to as rustics, farmers and working class men. None of these men, not even the officers, were noblemen, and he felt this whole war was kind of beneath him. He was a gentleman, noble by birth, and he did not feel it was that was appropriate for him to be fighting here with these rustics. And in fact, he was so embarrassed by this defeat at Yorktown, he refused to face Washington on the field of battle for the traditional presentation of the saber. So he sent his aide, his adjutant, out to present the saber on his behalf. What's funny about this is that the artist that painted this picture was not at the Battle of Yorktown. This painting was done some years later, but the original version of this painting depicted Cornwallis here on his horse surrendering, which of course was not accurate. Historians of the time confronted the artist and had him to reproduce the painting, showing someone else. Actually, he retouched the painting, showing that someone else was surrendering in place of Cornwallis. Just a little bit of historical trivia for you there. It's another example of how art will influence our perception of history. Had the artist left Cornwallis's image in the painting, we might very well have assumed that different things took place than actually happened. So let's talk about the aftermath of the war. And this is, whenever we're talking about any kind of war, this is probably the most important aspect of it. What happens during the war is important, and we don't want to suggest otherwise. But in the wars, as they play a role in history, the cause and effect are the most significant aspects of the war. The events of the war itself are somewhat less important. So we've already discussed at length all the causes of the revolution and this degenerating relationship between the American colonies and their parent nation of England. But aftermath of war is often the more important part, because this is what's going to leave an impact on the future. A lot of what is remembered of a war is based on the result of the war. Who wins? Who gets to write the history book? What happens as a result? What changes are made? and how the result of the war impact later generations. So just some numbers here. About 33 American casualties are going to result from the war, and these are military casualties, men involved with the fighting. About 33,000. 25,000 of those are going to be the result from battlefield casualties. 17,000 of that total is going to be from disease. We talked about how disease impacted the Army at Valley Forge, and that's just one example. Other disease outbreaks are common in military camps where sanitation and hygiene are not top priorities. And this is just a historical, this is actually a pretty good ratio. Historically, we see very often disease casualties outnumbering battlefield casualties more than 10 to 1. So these are actually pretty good numbers in terms of ratio of battlefield deaths to disease deaths. Another 8,000 or so men will be wounded but survive. So this is all the total of our 33,000 casualties. A little note here too on collateral damage. There was several other disease outbreaks. There was a smallpox outbreak during the Revolution, which claimed the lives of around 100,000 Americans. Now these were not soldiers. Some were soldiers. Some of these disease deaths here are part of that smallpox outbreak. But most of those 100,000 deaths from smallpox were civilians. And you have to look at too. There's a lot of refugees that result from war as towns are burned and destroyed, farms are destroyed. We end up with a lot of refugees. People are displaced. Significant portions of the population end up displaced as a result of war, living in camps or crowded conditions, and disease outbreaks in those situations are very common. And of course, the smallpox outbreak is partly a result of that. So when we look at numbers of casualties in terms of war, it's important to break those numbers down and look at who is dying from what, because that's important too. Very often the case is you look at different sources of information, you'll see different numbers of casualties. It's important to look at a breakdown of those casualties and see, okay, how many of these men are actually being killed as a result of the war, and how many are dying from disease, and what those numbers tell us about the conditions present during a war. In terms of money, this war will cost about $144 million for the Americans. Congress raised a lot of this money from various sources. About 30 million of this 144 million was borrowed. Early in the war, the Continental Congress approved the selling of essentially what they call war bonds. Basically, these were debt certificates or bond certificates sold as a way to raise money for the Continental Army. So there's $30 million worth of debt that Congress owes to various people and various countries as a result of the war. And of course, on the note of debt too, each of the individual 13 colonies, now calling themselves 13 states, each of these 13 states will also have a significant amount of debt as a result of the war, because the states themselves borrowed heavily in order to pay their militias and to pay for the supplies they needed for the war. Though these numbers here just reflect what is owed by our Congress, our Continental Congress. So we'll talk about how this creates a problem later on in terms of how the newly formed United States is going to pay off these debts. One thing that's interesting about these last couple of years of the war after the Battle of Yorktown is that both sides are eager to reconcile this issue. The Americans are eager to bring an end to the war for obvious reasons, because a victory in this war now assures our independence, which was our goal. That was the big prize that we were working toward. So Americans are obviously eager to end this war, but the British are also very eager to bring an end to the war, and for different reasons. Remember a week or so ago, we talked about the amount of debt that England had amassed through its colonial wars for empire. Well, this American Revolution ends up as functioning in the same way as another war for empire, and as such, England amasses even more debt fighting this revolution. That the British economy is in serious jeopardy at this point. They owe so much, they've borrowed so heavily to fight all these wars for empire that England has more debt now than it can realistically pay off. And the British people back in England are growing very weary of these continuous wars. And there's a lot of pressure from the British public toward the British government to bring an end to this war. The British people they're like, hey, look, if those colonies want to go that badly, let them go. We can't afford to pay for any more of these wars. It's so expensive. The British government told the British people early on, this is going to be an easy war. It'll be over in a few months, and it's a quick victory, and we'll be back to normal. The British people are like, where's our quick victory? You said this is going to be a quick victory. That was 6 years ago. This is costing us a fortune. So there's a lot of pressure, internal pressure in England to bring an end to this war, if for no other reason to salvage their economy. So both sides are eager to reconcile. Of course, one of the reasons that they're both so eager is to resume normal economic relationships, because at this point, England's biggest trading partner is the North American colonies. And of course, for the North American colonies, our biggest trading partner is England. So a restoration of normal relationships between England and the American colonies is going to restore trade, which is going to generate revenue, which will help both sides pay off their massive debt. So here we see a situation where both the Americans and the British are very eager to bring an end to this conflict so that they can normalize relationships. Well, the end of that conflict will take place officially in Paris in 1783. Here we have another Treaty of Paris. So this is why the dates are important in this particular instance. So Treaty of Paris, 1783, signed between the newly formed United States and the British Empire, or England. The treaty has quite a few provisions. We won't go into all of them, but the big things we want to remember about this Treaty of Paris are that, first and foremost, England is going to recognize U.S. independence. And this is so very important. This is international recognition of our sovereignty. And yes, this sends a message. This Treaty of Paris, where England signs on the dotted line, officially recognizing the United States as a sovereign, independent nation, this is what gives us credibility on the international community. We are now an independent nation, so recognized by the most powerful nation in the world at the point, England. It's one thing to say that you're independent. Remember the Declaration of Independence. We declare ourselves to be independent. Well, that's just a piece of paper that says independence on it. Just because we say it doesn't mean that it's true. It doesn't mean that it's official. We might think of ourselves as independent, but until the rest of the world acknowledges that independence and recognizes it, it's just our word against theirs. Here, England, one of the most powerful nations in the world at this point, has provided official written documentation acknowledging our independence. This is a big deal. This gives us a lot of credibility on the world stage in terms of the international community. So, and this is what we wanted. This was the big prize. We wanted, ultimately we wanted England to just agree to allow us a certain amount of autonomy within their empire. But this is more than we could have hoped for. England now recognizes us as an independent nation. This is a big deal. And of course, our in terms of tangible gains in this war, the Treaty of Paris gives us claim to an enormous amount of territory. Take a look at our map here. Here we have another before and after image. I like these because it really helps you visualize what has taken place in the course of the war. 1775, before the war begins, the British control pretty much the whole eastern half of North America. Everything east of the Mississippi River is British territory. After the American Revolution, as a result of the Treaty of Paris, America now, or excuse me, the United States now controls everything from the Great Lakes down to Florida and from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic coast. This is a huge piece of territory here. It's not just the area occupied by the 13 colonies along the coast. It's everything over to the Mississippi River. This is a large territory. It not only secures our colonial territories, it also provides us with potential for future expansion out here in the frontier. This is a big deal. Now we notice here that Florida has once again changed hands. Florida has changed hands several times in our story so far, and it will again later on. We'll talk about that next week. So because Spain joined the war on our side, we're going to, and of course, the fact that they are currently in possession of it. Remember, Spain seized Florida from British troops late in the war. Since Spain currently possesses Florida, we're just going to go ahead and give it back to them officially. So in Treaty of Paris, we'll also designate Florida now as a Spanish possession. There's a little bit of gray area here. You see this spot here on the map. Part of this territory is going to be claimed by both the United States and Spain. Unfortunately, the Treaty of Paris did not specify the border of Florida and the United States, so this is going to be contested for several years. One of our first big diplomatic crises will be over this contested area between Spanish Florida and the United States. So just get a little bit of foreshadowing there as far as what's going on. You'll notice too that while the United States won the revolution, we won our independence, and we won a significant portion of territory, England is not totally out of the story yet. England will retain what is today Canada. So all this remains a British colony, British territory, and it still is technically, Canada is in some ways still considered part of the British Empire, but even though they're an independent nation. At any rate, England will continue to be part of our story for many years to come. In fact, another one of our diplomatic issues that we're going to be faced with as a newly independent nation will be border disputes along the Great Lakes and this northern part of New England. So while we did get this territory here, the specific borders are not clearly defined, and that'll be a source of diplomatic tension between the United States and England, and between the United States and Spain in the early years of our republic. So independence will bring some challenges, as we'll discuss in the next week or two. All right, let's talk a little bit about impact and unresolved issues. While independence was a major goal of the revolution, and all of the 13 colonies were united in this goal of independence. If you remember the Declaration of Independence, it was signed by all 13 colonies. They all agreed that independence was the goal. Well, now that that goal has been achieved, there's not really a lot for these 13 states to agree upon. And we'll see this becoming the source of many challenges that we'll face as a new nation. So a lot of these problems that result as part of the impact of the war, a lot of these leftover issues, politics is one of the big ones. Politics, specifically in terms of how this new United States is going to be governed, this is a point of a lot of debate. We'll spend the next 10 years debating this. It's going to be several years before we can come up with a constitution that all these colonies, all these new states are going to agree to. So our system of government is one of the first big issues. We all agreed, all 13 colonies agreed on independence, but once the independence is achieved, they cannot agree on how to govern these newly independent states. There's a lot of debate, and most of that debate centers around this issue right here. A strong central government versus independent states. There's a lot of people who support the idea of the 13 states going 13 different ways, doing their own thing. There's an equal number of people who support the idea of a strong central government managing or governing a united states. So there's a lot of disagreement here on how the country should be governed. Should it be a central government, a federal government, or should we have just independent states? So this is an issue that's going to take a lot of years to resolve. Another issue that we're going to have to deal with as a people, as a culture, is that there's a lot of uncertainty as to who we are. We fought a war to become independent from British, so we don't want to think of ourselves as British. Yet culturally, our language, our religion, our traditions, our economy, all of those things are tied very closely to the British cultural identity. So it's going to be a long time before we can really put our finger on a specific American cultural identity. So we'll wrestle with this question for several years. Who are we, and what does it mean to be an American? So this sense of an American identity is going to be one of the things that we'll have to basically create from scratch. There's going to be a lot of unresolved issues here. We just fought a war for freedom and liberty and justice and all these things. Remember Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams speaking in these houses of government. Referring to we don't want to be British slaves. We don't want to be slaves of the British Empire and slaves of tyranny, and so on and so forth. We want freedom and liberty and the right to choose our own path. All of these ideals surrounding liberty and freedom. Yet, once we achieve independence, there will be a significant portion of our population that will have absolutely no access to anything that looks like freedom or liberty. We'll still have slavery. Slavery will continue to exist as an institution after the Revolution. A little footnote for you here. The original version of the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson wrote included a harsh condemnation of the institution of slavery. But when they read it in Congress, none of the southern colonies would sign it. They rely, of course, heavily on slave labor. The southern colonies, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, we're not signing that. We refuse to sign a document that condemns slavery. So Jefferson had to go back and revise the Declaration of Independence and remove that condemnation of slavery in order for those southern colonies to sign it. So slavery is an issue that we're going to have to deal with. Both Washington and Jefferson were slave owners. They owned large plantations worked by large numbers of slaves. Yet in their journals and their letters, they both admitted that the institution of slavery was not consistent with the ideas of liberty and equality. So as a nation, we are going to wrestle with this issue for many years to come. It's going to be 150 years before we as a nation really begin to deal with this issue of slavery, despite the fact that we fought a war for independence and freedom and liberty. So again, a lot of unresolved issues here. There's going to be a lot of conflict between our ideas of we want to settle in the Western territories. We want to expand our nation, but Native Americans are still living out there. So there's going to be a lot of conflict between our desire to expand our new nation freely, and our right and our freedom to expand as a nation is going to come into conflict with the rights of Native Americans to occupy land that they've been on for centuries. So Native Americans are going to be excluded from this idea of liberty and freedom, as well as the slaves. Finally, women are going to be the last group of people left out here. Women are going to play an important role during the Revolution. We know from the stories of people like Betsy Ross and Abigail Adams, both of whom played prominent roles in the Revolution, we know that women are beginning to see themselves as playing a larger role in society. But they are going to be left out as well. Now, it's important to note here that in terms of women's rights and women's activism, as far as women's equality goes, that won't coalesce into a true movement until well into the 1800s, in the 1840s. But even as early as the 1780s, the seeds of that movement are beginning to take root. In letters between Abigail Adams and her husband John Adams, she expresses this idea that women have played an important role in the revolution, and we would like our role in society to reflect the importance that we've played in this revolution. And there, so there we see the first hints of a desire for equality among women in those letters, but that won't become important. It won't become part of the story until many years later. So three major groups of our society are going to be completely excluded from liberty and equality. So we've got some serious unresolved issues here in terms of what's left over after the revolution. And all of these things point to one conclusion here, that the American Revolution was not really a true revolution. We achieved political independence, but there was no social progress or true political change after the war. So social and political change didn't really take place in the way that you normally associate with a revolution. A revolution suggests that there's going to be complete upheaval. The old ways of doing things are abandoned in favor of new ways of doing things, and that simply doesn't take place after the American Revolution. All the same people who were in charge prior to the revolution in terms of colonial leadership, they are all now the state governments. So local politicians before the revolution are the same as local politicians after the revolution. The same people who have the right to vote are the same people who have the right to vote after the revolution. So no one else is included. We don't see any significant changes in our social and political structures after the revolution. The only thing that's different is that we are now politically independent from England. Everything else remains the same. Same type of economy, the same type of political structures and organizations, the same type of attitudes in terms of who gets to participate in government and who doesn't get to participate. None of those things change. So it all points to this question. When we talk about this American Revolution as a struggle for liberty and freedom, who exactly is going to be entitled to this liberty and freedom? This is the big question. And this question is one that we still wrestle with today. The story of America after the revolution becomes a story of the evolution of democracy. Over the course of the rest of the semester, we'll talk about how democracy is gradually expanded after the revolution. Every few decades or so, more and more people will become included in this liberty and freedom. You will talk about how women struggle to gain their piece of freedom, how an abolitionist movement struggles to give equality and freedom to slaves. And of course, Native Americans will be still part of this story as well. And as time goes on, more and more people will be included in the story. And so this idea of liberty and freedom is not something that is achieved by the revolution, but is a process that has begun with the revolution. So the revolution is not the end of our story. It is only the beginning. It's the beginning of this process where America will gradually, over the next couple hundred years, become more and more like the ideals that were represented in the revolution. That's all we have time for next week. When we come back next week, we will discuss how that process begins with the formation of a new government. So until then, we'll see you next time.